Sarah had always thought that some secrets were meant to stay hidden forever. Standing in the doorway of her old high school classroom 20 years later, she wondered if she'd been wrong about that all along. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across empty desks that once held the dreams and worries of teenagers who had long since gone to different parts of the world. The smell of chalk dust and old textbooks still hung in the air, as if time had forgotten to clear them away with everything else. She hadn't meant to come here. Not really. The high school reunion planning committee meeting had ended early, and instead of heading straight home to her quiet apartment and stack of ungraded papers, something had pulled her down the familiar hallway to room 237, her old English classroom. The place where she'd first fallen in love with literature, with teaching, and though she'd never admitted it to anyone, with someone she could never have. "I thought I might find you here." The voice from behind made her heart skip in a way that felt both strange and very familiar. She turned slowly, already knowing who she would see, already feeling the ground shift beneath her feet the way it had when she was 17. David Matthews stood in the doorway, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, his eyes still the same warm brown that had once made her forget how to breathe during AP literature discussions. He was broader now, more settled in his skin, but the way he leaned against the doorframe was exactly the same as it had been 2 decades ago. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly, and the sound of her name in his voice took her right back to a time when the biggest decision in her life was whether to raise her hand in class, just to see him smile. "David," she managed, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. "I heard you were coming to the reunion." He stepped into the classroom, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Are you surprised?" She laughed, a sound that came out more nervous than she'd intended. "Honestly, yes. You always said you'd never look back. People change." He moved closer, stopping beside the desk where she used to sit in the 3rd row, second seat from the window. "Some things are worth looking back for." There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully. Lines around his eyes spoke of years she hadn't been part of, experiences she didn't know about. He wore a simple wedding ring, she noticed, and the sight of it sent a small, sharp pain through her chest. "How's your wife?" she asked, because it seemed like the right thing to do. The mature thing, the question that would remind them both of the boundaries that should exist. David's expression shifted, became carefully neutral in a way that made her stomach tighten. "We divorced 3 years ago. Oh." The word escaped before she could stop it. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from countless afternoons when he'd stayed after class to help struggling students or discuss essay topics with anyone brave enough to approach his desk. "It was the right decision for both of us." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken questions and 20 years of separation. Sarah found herself looking around the classroom, anywhere but at him, trying to ground herself in the familiar surroundings. "Mrs. Henderson retired 10 years ago," she said finally, gesturing toward the teacher's desk at the front of the room. "I heard she moved to Florida. I know." David's voice was quiet. "I kept in touch with her for a while. She told me you'd become a teacher too." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "She talked about me. She was proud of you, said you were one of the best students she'd ever had and an even better teacher." He paused, his gaze finding hers. "She also said you never married." The directness of the statement caught her off guard. "No, I know, I didn't." "Why not?" It was such a simple question, but the weight of it settled on her shoulders like a heavy coat. How could she explain that no one had ever measured up to a memory? That she'd spent years trying to forget the way her heart had raced every time he'd handed back a graded paper, the electricity she'd felt when their fingers accidentally touched the impossible dream she'd harbored of a future that could never be. I was focused on my career, she said instead, which was true, if not complete. David nodded slowly, but something in his eyes suggested he heard what she hadn't said. You teach high school English now for 15 years. She found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the shift to safer ground at Jefferson High across town. I love it. I bet your students adore you. There was warmth in his voice that made her look up at him. You always had this way of making literature come alive even in class discussions. When you talk about a character's motivations or the symbolism in a poem, everyone would stop what they were doing to listen. You remember that? I remember everything about those classes. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. I remember you in that blue sweater you wore every Tuesday, how you'd bite your lip when you were thinking about a difficult question, way you'd light up when you finally understood a complex metaphor. Sarah's breath caught. David, I remember wondering what it would be like to kiss you. The words hung in the air between them, bold and dangerous, and 20 years too late. Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis, the same way it had the day she'd realized her feelings for. Her teacher had crossed a line from admiration into something deeper, more dangerous. You can't say things like that, she whispered. Why not? He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, different from what he'd worn in high school, but somehow still distinctly him. We're not teacher and student anymore, Sarah. We're just two people who... She stepped back, her voice stronger. Now, who had an inappropriate relationship 20 years ago. You were my teacher, David. You were married. I was 17. Nothing happened, he said quietly. But it could have. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. We both know it could have. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Is that why you stopped coming to class the last month of senior year? Why you switched to independent study? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd hoped he'd never noticed, never connected her sudden absence with the growing tension between them. The way every interaction had begun to feel charged with possibility and danger. I was scared, she admitted, of what I was feeling, of what I might do. So was I. His voice was barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea how many nights I lay awake thinking about you, wondering if I was losing my mind, if I was the worst kind of person for having feelings for a student? David, don't. I applied for transfers 3 different times that year. He continued, as if he needed to get the words out. I tried to convince myself it was just a passing thing, that if I could just get through graduation, you'd be gone and I could forget. But you didn't transfer. No. He ran both hands through his hair now, a gesture of frustration she remembered well. Because I was a coward. Because leaving would have meant admitting what I was feeling, and I wasn't brave enough for that. Sarah leaned against one of the student desks, needing the support. So what happened after graduation? I threw myself into my marriage, had 2 kids, bought a house in the suburbs, did everything I was supposed to do. His voice held a note of bitter regret. And I spent 20 years pretending that what I felt for you was just a teacher's pride in a gifted student. But it wasn't. No, he said simply. It wasn't. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and terrifying in its implications. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process what he was telling her, trying to reconcile the responsible, ethical teacher she'd known with the man standing before her, admitting to feelings that could have destroyed both their lives. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because I'm tired of living with regrets. He moved closer again, and this time she didn't step away. Because my marriage failed in part because I never fully gave my heart to someone else. Because I've spent 2 decades wondering what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances. At a different time. We can't change the past, David. No. But we can decide what to do with the present. His hand reached out, hovering just inches from her cheek. Sarah, I need you to know that what I felt for you then, it wasn't wrong because you were young, or because I was your teacher. It was wrong because of the power imbalance, because of what it could have done to your future, to your education, to your trust in authority figures. She opened her eyes, found him watching her with an intensity that made her knees weak. I know. But you're not 17 anymore, and I'm not your teacher. No, she whispered, we're not. His hand finally made contact with her cheek, his thumb tracing a gentle line along her cheekbone. The touch sent electricity shooting through her entire body, 20 years of suppressed longing coming to the surface in a rush that left her dizzy. Sarah. There was warning in his voice, but also hope. I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other as adults, that we might have built this up in our minds until it's bigger than reality. She took a step toward him. But I also know that I've spent 2 decades settling for less than what I really wanted, because I was too afraid to reach for something that felt too good to be true. David straightened, his eyes never leaving hers. What are you saying? I'm saying, yes. Her voice was stronger now, more certain. Yes to starting over. Yes to seeing what happens when 2 adults finally get the chance to explore something that was impossible 20 years ago. Yes to being brave enough to find out if what we felt was real. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, warm and bright and full of promise. He crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides, his hands finding her face again, this time with certainty rather than hesitation. Are you sure? He whispered, his lips inches from hers. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When he kissed her, it was everything she'd imagined, and nothing like she'd expected, soft and firm at the same time. Tender but with an underlying passion that spoke of years of waiting, of dreams finally becoming reality. She melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, 20 years of longing pouring into that single, perfect moment. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid beat of his heart. So what now? She asked. Now, he said, his arms tightening around her. We take it one day at a time. We get to know each other as we are now, not as we were then. We see if what we built up in our memories can survive in the real world. And if it can't, then at least we'll know. At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering what if. Sarah pulled back to look at him, seeing her own hope and fear reflected in his eyes. I'm scared it won't be what we've imagined. I'm scared it will be, he admitted with a rueful smile. I'm scared that you'll turn out to be everything I've dreamed of for 20 years, and I won't know how to handle that kind of happiness. Well then, she said, standing on her tiptoes to press another soft kiss to his lips. I guess we'll have to be scared together. As they left the empty classroom hand in hand, Sarah couldn't help but look back one more time at the place where it all began. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the desks, transforming the familiar space into something that looked like possibility. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had sat in that 3rd row, dreaming impossible dreams about her English teacher, never imagining that those dreams might someday have a chance to come true. She thought about the years of settling, of convincing herself that what she'd felt wasn't real, of building a life that was safe, but somehow incomplete. And she thought about the future, uncertain and terrifying and beautiful in its potential. No regrets? David asked softly, squeezing her hand. Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Not anymore. As they walked down the empty hallway together, their footsteps echoing in the silence, She realized that sometimes the most important lessons aren't learned in classrooms at all. Sometimes they're learned in the space between heartbeats, in the moment when you finally stop running from your own truth and decide to chase it instead. The classroom might have been empty when she'd first walked in that afternoon, but she was leaving with her heart fuller than it had been in 20 years. And for the first time since she was 17, Sarah believed that the best of her story was still being written.